Okay, I think the way we're going to kind of go through this is we'll kind of try to stay in topics. So we're going to start first with just kind of relationship topics. We'll give these guys a ease into things, if that's okay. The first question that I'm going to say, it says, how can I explain my purity commitment in a loving way to those who don't understand?
Good question.
Let's jump in.
Yeah, I will. I think that we often get caught up in what everybody else thinks is the right way to think, and we forget that sometimes people will admire us when we stand up for something that we believe in. And very different issue, but several years after high school, I received a letter from a friend who just talked about the testimony that she saw in me when I walked away from the group that was always participating in something that I knew I shouldn't. So that testimony, it's hard to say in the moment, but you are showing your friends that you have some standard and some belief that maybe is kind of strange to them, different to them, but it can be a testimony to them. So it's one thing to think about, to share that with them.
I think it's important to also realize that if you are in a conversation where you're talking about something that's this personal, most likely that other person knows other things about you that would lead them to understand where you're coming from as far as whether it's your faith or the family that you've been raised in. Like, they generally will know your values, and if they don't, that's a good place to start. And another thing I would, in the way that the question is worded, in a loving way, I think that is so key. Because when we are abstaining from something that other people are engaging in, and it doesn't even have to be a sexual thing, it can tend to come off as judgment simply because we're not doing the same thing as everyone else. And so we have to be careful about how we're doing the abstaining and how we act when those things are going on around us, so that it doesn't come off as a judgment, even if you're not saying a judging thing or imposing your view on someone else. We have to be careful about what that looks like in the moment. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes, you alluded to this, sometimes they feel judgment even if you are not judging them. This is what, for me, and I think the Holy Spirit in us sometimes convicts other people just because He's present.
Mm-hmm. Anything else with that? Why is it so important to wait for marriage? If you are engaged or in a serious relationship, how does it make it any different?
And, right, we're definitely talking about sexual activity.
Yes.
So put that,
Yeah.
get in there.
We're all looking at you, thought you were gonna.
I thought you were
Oh, sorry, no, I mean, a few things that, do you think now is the oxytocin time? I don't know.
Do you want me to come back to this one?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
well,
think Do we need to get into sex more before we get to this one?
That's rather sudden.
Okay.
Maybe we'll come back to the promise, because that's one of the best.
we promise that we are like party enough for that.
Okay.
I don't know how it took us off guard. We'll get there.
How about this one? How do I honor God in a dating relationship?
Well, I can speak specifically to a situation in my life that may not necessarily apply to everyone, but one of the things that in my own upbringing, my parents were really involved in setting my dating boundaries. Both my husband's parents and my parents were involved as well. And at first it felt really overbearing having 4 people involved in this 2-person relationship. And unfortunately, we broke some of the promises that we had made to our parents about what we were and were not comfortable with doing, what we were going to do. And so even though some would say that we were still so pure because we didn't do X, Y, or Z, the fact that I broke trust with my parents is still a problem that's a relationship that I had to restore. And so I think it's not necessarily only about, did I cross this sexual intercourse line or not? It has everything to do with the relationships that you're in, and not only with that person, but with your parents, with your the people that you were explaining your purity commitment to. The people that know your standards, that those relationships are important, and how you approach your witness and your trust with other people matters. And so I think honoring God in a dating relationship is more than just, did I cross that line?
I think recognizing too that any relationship is a potential long-term relationship. I know several people who are married to their high school sweethearts. So you could think, well, I'm just gonna date around in high school and then I'll get serious about the standards that I want for a husband. You might not get that second chance. You might fall in love now with a guy that you think, oh, this will be my first boyfriend and I know he's not what God would want me to be in. But you don't know where any relationship is gonna go. So determining what do you, looking in the future, in 15, 20 years, do you want to be in a Christian marriage? Do you want a man who's going to grow spiritually with you? Then that's something you choose now. And that can be tough when you're surrounded by boys who don't claim Christ, but that's something to think about. And get to know him, get to know the Lord, have devotions, be in his word. If you don't know what that looks like, I think you can probably talk to your leaders here and Pastor Ben, but allow the Lord to be a part of your relationships. You can talk to him at any time. As you're heading out for a date, Lord, I want to honor you tonight. Help you to remember that you're here with us. But I'm rambling. Okay, stop.
I'm going to just add to that. I think when you remember that you are an image bearer of God, and this person that you're in a relationship with is a fellow image bearer of God, that is a great way to make sure that you are treating them the way that you should, and that they are treating you the way that they should. When it's not just, how far can I go with this person, or, what is the line that I cannot cross, but it becomes an act of respecting that person and expecting respect in return because they are a fellow image bearer of God. It kind of changes the way that you look at a relationship. So, anything?
I think one other thing, like when I think of honoring God, part of that for me is it's not just like an action, like a behavioral, well, if I did this thing, then it wasn't honoring God. It feels like it goes, like the roots go a little bit deeper with that, to like, if Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were like, no, I trust my good father, right? There would be a completely different end to their story, and if we did that as well, that would be a very different end to our story, right? And so that sense of like, there are some things that aren't perfectly defined, and we're going to get to something like masturbation. We're going to talk about that tonight. But then there are some things that are really well defined, where God is like, and until you're married, this is the thing I want you to put over here on the other side of marriage. And trusting his good fatherness is what creates that for us, that puts those boundaries in place for our good and for our safety. So I think that's part of it. And I think also like digging the well deep into God, because you guys are young, but I would be shocked if none of you would say, like, there's never been any hard thing that has happened in my life yet. And then as the older I get, the more of those hard things, the more I realize, like Corey Tenry said, like, there's no well that's so deep that God is not deeper. That, like, there's, at any age, we can just need him and lean into him, and also have this presence and dignity that we cannot get anyplace else besides our relationship with him. And that it's sold to us in the world that we can get it through working really hard and having this big fancy job and making this, or having this kind of family if we're in very Christian circles or whatever. But all of it is distracting us from a value and worth that we can just get from being God's child and from just digging deep, and that we can walk in a way with our heads held higher that you can never earn from anything you could accomplish in your lifetime. It just is what it is. And so I feel like that, the relationship is what, he died to win us so that we can be in heaven forever with him, right? Like, he wants our hearts, and he is the best, and most respectful, and gives us the most dignity that our heart could ever have with anyone. So,
Talking about boundaries, how do you say no to a guy without looking lame? Is it even possible? Let's take this both ways. How do you say, because it's not implied, it doesn't say here, but how do you say no, whether that's dating, you know, to someone who asks you out on a date, you want to say no, or if somebody asks for a sexual relationship that you do not want to have. So, how do you say no?
Well, I definitely think those are important distinctions. As far as just declining a date with a person who's well-intentioned, or at best what you can surmise at that point, I think we have to be gentle with our brothers, right?
Mhm.
Like, even though we are not interested in pursuing that kind of relationship, it's important that we, again, are realizing their image-bearing potential as well, and so respect is important. And so there is a way to be kind and say, no, thank you. There's a way to be kind and say, I'm not interested, without being demeaning, without, in the best way that you can. I mean, obviously, they will probably be disappointed, and that's okay. They're allowed to feel that feeling of disappointment. But I think there's a different turn that we take when you are already engaged in a relationship and they would like a sexual relationship.
Mhm.
It's important to set a boundary, and it's not that I am not sympathetic with that feeling of not wanting to look lame, but at the same time, exercising boundaries is a tool that you're gonna need in your toolbox that is outside the bounds of sexuality. That is an important tool as an adult that you're gonna need. And it is important to understand that when that boundary is set, the person who could have benefited from that boundary not being there, they're going to feel a loss of that contact, and that's okay. They are allowed to feel disappointed by your no. But it doesn't mean that the boundary was wrong. It means that they are reacting to the boundary being there. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Anyone else have any further questions with that, or, okay?
I do think with, and this sounds very challenging in your position, but like, as you think about a dating relationship, the time to choose to set a boundary is not in the moment
Mhm.
when you're alone and your hormones are raging, right? So like that, this is not Christian advice, but like, it's like, if you can't talk about it, you shouldn't be doing it, right? And why it's not Christian advice is that any of us that are unmarried people, maybe we would be very free and comfortable talking with anyone about sex, and that God didn't say like, okay, right, that wasn't the Bible. But like, it's a general principle of like, okay, right? Like, if you don't have the maturity to say out loud, hey, like, I just need to say about this is where I stand and this is what, then that's also a good sign that you probably shouldn't be heading in that direction, right?
Mhm.
I didn't think about this before when I saw these questions ahead of time, but this does show a little bit of the, I think the difference between men and women. There aren't men asking this question of them.
Mhm.
Because they think of this as, well, I shouldn't say that, because men are all different, just like we are all different. But for women, any kind of physical intimacy is a very emotional connection. It's not just physical. And for a lot of men, it is just physical, especially if they're not committed to you in a relationship. But even when they are, it's a very different emotional reaction for them. And so to not look lame, you might feel lame, and he might say you're lame, but if he gets what he wants, he could walk away from you and never ever acknowledge you again, because there's not been any emotional connection. And he doesn't feel lame that he used your yes and then walked away and is on to the next thing. So remember the future beyond just that feeling in that moment, and what is his reaction going to be? It might be very different. So are you okay with that boundary? I think that boundary is good to remember, because the reaction you know, maybe it doesn't, I know it does matter, reactions are hard for us, but, your reaction to a no would be very different than a guy's reaction, and that's important to remember. I think you've got something to stand up for your own self-respect.
Yeah, and that's one thing I was thinking there, in my counseling practice and when I work with teens and all kinds of people, that the boundaries that you were talking about, you know, those are important, very important sexually. They're important with our girlfriends, you know, there are plenty of people out there who are just gonna, they recognize that they have a need, and if you can fill it by listening to me for 7 hours tonight while I talk to you about how sad I am, and like, no, you did fail your test the next day, but like, I slept fine because I needed to talk to someone for 7 hours, and it was gonna be you. You know, like, if you don't get to a place to set those boundaries, there's a principle that's like a boundary is the space at which I can love both you and myself, right? And so you get to count yourself and your own dignity and your own whatever you needed to get done as something that you respect as equally as that other person. And so knowing that, like, well, if I say yes, if I give this person what they want so that I don't look lame or whatever, but also there's loss and grief on my side of it, and maybe the expectations I had about what was gonna happen next, how valued I was gonna feel after that, that's not honored. That is part of what I need to consider in setting that boundary, right?
This is a follow-up. Why is it so oh no, I'm sorry. That was we're not doing that yet. Where was it?
That would be okay.
There's another one about how do I send a message to a guy in my life that I'm not interested in pursuing a romantic relationship with him? Kind of very similar, but
You talked about that, so.
Yeah, I don't know that I can write you a message right now without knowing context, but like I said before, I think respect is important. Susie was talking about the emotional connections that we have and the way that we would respond to a no versus the way they would respond to a no. It is still a no that if they haven't invested enough to ask, then we have to respect wherever they are on that spectrum. And so we can still honor their dignity at the same time as saying, I'm not interested in that level of connection.
I also think that there's a time and a place for if, and I mean, that sounds great. I also think there's a time and a place for like, and this is the third time they've asked.
Right.
And
Yes.
you still have the same opinion that
Right.
you had the first
Mhm.
time they asked. Like, there's a time and a place for getting more firm.
Yeah.
And like,
That's right.
I thought we went over this already. I'm confused here. Like, that's a pretty firm no, I'll come back to you if anything changes.
Right.
Right, but like that sense, there's a certain point where like it is, where I feel like you don't have to be as nice, especially with that the world, like, you know, when it comes to sexuality, it's not to be scary, but it's not, women are more vulnerable than men in general. And so sometimes it's really important to be able to use your voice and be clear. And like, that's a no. I like that's a pretty hard no. Like, final answer on that, you know?
Respect can be very firm.
Right. And then you don't want to start, you don't need to start there necessarily, but to have that, the strength to go there. And then, I mean, you consult with your parents, or even you do it all the time in therapy. I'm like role playing with someone, and I'm the person who's like a little bit sleazy, or maybe not, but you're just not interested in it. Come on. You know, because we need practice of that, I think, especially as women, and a lot of times as Christian women too, we have, like, I had this phrase I used to use that was like Christian nice, like, well, I couldn't say, no, thank you, I can't work in the nursery, like, if then I wouldn't be a good Christian woman, like, you know, those kinds of things, but sometimes that's not what you're called to do, and so that's okay.
how do we as Christians respond to others sharing that they have had sexual interactions outside of marriage and they think that it's okay?
I like how it's, you know, obviously obviously, and I feel like you've done a great job in talking about that, Sarah, it's that, we're looking at the balancing act. And again, part of what you want to take into consideration is this literally someone you're overhearing in the line to get your food in the cafeteria? Like, hey, that's sin. Hey, I heard you, right? Or is this a person in your sphere of influence, right? And then if they're in your sphere of influence, like being prayerful about that. Because I don't think it's our job to call out every sin. Now, as a good friend, maybe, like, there are some things we'll talk about tonight that have to do with hormones in our bodies and different things. There could be things like that even my non-Christian clients, I'm like, hey, here's a heads up. Here's just something I want you to know. And like, just so you know that you might be adding some extra challenges to your road if you choose this, But otherwise, even sometimes with that, they're having a sexual relationship with a peer might not be the most serious thing that's happening in their life right now. That might not be the situation that God is trying to call them away from, and that ultimately their salvation and their having a deep and true relationship with God is way more important than any individual, I can become the modesty police and say oh, that sure needs to be way higher, non-Christian friend, right? I can say that, but is that God telling me that that's the most important thing they need to hear today when they don't know that he loves them and how much dignity that gives them, right? So I think that's one of the parts of the balancing act, and I don't know if you guys are, and then here's what you should say.
No, I was just thinking that along that same line, there has to be an element of compassion, and context matters in this situation, like you were talking about, as far as is this friend confiding in you a situation that they're not really sure about this? If that's the case, that's an opportunity. So in answer to this question, I would say read the room, man. If there's an opportunity for you to speak into that person's life, awesome. Proceed with caution. Because that position that they're in is a vulnerable one. And so we have to be very compassionate on their vulnerability. At the same time that if we do decide to speak into their life, it has to be in a loving way. Because as you were saying, the salvation and their relationship with Jesus just trumps everything. And these things, if they are pursuing that relationship with Jesus, these things will fall in line with it. So I think there is definitely a time and a place that you don't call it out, like she was talking about. I would just say, read the room.
Okay. Thinking about dating, what are the best traits to look for in a guy? Wow, guys.
I know.
You're just gushing over here about our male brothers.
It's tricky though, because we also so you have your good Christian answers that you should have of this person's character, right? That you can trust that what they say is what they'll do, right? Because you don't have a relationship if you don't have that, and their ability to be committed to something and finish it, their ability to be you've seen them in a position where they've hit their head really hard on something and you can tell how they're going to respond when they just got hurt or when that kind of thing, because life is there's going to be so many types of adversity that you guys are going to face. And so knowing that, and people who are oh, he's really good with kids, or how he treats the waitress, right? Those kinds of things that you're those are really important character issues. I would say some of us though are maybe it doesn't matter if they have a sense of humor or not, but to me it feels like it maybe would matter a little bit that they would at least have a time. Maybe they don't have their own sense of humor, but at least they think I'm funny. There are many compromises that could be made, but someone who's I don't think that's the person for me, right? So that's why I was like, oh, I don't know, right?
I think friendship is so important
Mhm.
because I don't know if any of you have heard of the Screw Tape Letters, but it's this amazing book that's written from Satan's perspective. Like, let's figure out how to get humans to mess up and ruin their lives. And one of the chapters talks about, hey, I have an idea. This is Satan talking, remember? And he says, let's get them to fall in love and then build a marriage on falling in love. And I read that, I'm like, what do you mean? That's where we start. And the rest of the chapter talks about people fall out of love. And there are days when I wake up and I look at this man in my bed and I'm like, I fell in love with that. Especially after 31 years, and he says the same thing about me. And the friendship is just so important. And the love does come and go. I mean, it's there. I don't want to scare you. It hasn't died. But my heart doesn't flip anymore. I'm not that same ushy-gushy in love, he could do no wrong kind of a feeling. But the friendship and the laughter and the trust, and when we have broken trust with each other, we've been able to talk through it and, slowly rebuild that again over time. And so the friendship is really, really important. That's a big part of it too.
And so to piggyback off of that, I've had an opportunity to do lots of trainings on relationships, because that's a lot of what I do as a therapist. And these experts that have been just studying relationships for like 50 years essentially say that like the marriages that are the successful, the masters and not the disasters of therapy, are the ones that are based on friendships. And literally, like when they go through and they've done studies on people's satisfaction with marriage and even their satisfaction sexually, that marriages that have a solid base of friendship see themselves as having better sex than those that don't, in addition to everything else. So I feel like there's even like just science, behind what you're saying. And additionally, that piece of like falling in and out of love, there are like these 7 to 10 hormones that are flooding through your body when you're in a state of love, and in our field we call it limerence. And a lot of them are really interesting when I got to learn about them, and we'll talk a little bit more about one of them, but there are some that literally make you less irritable. So like when you watch TV or see other people that are like, I'm just never annoyed by that person. Like, we're so in love, there's nothing they can do. That hormone goes away. It literally goes away, and it does not come back. And then we're like, we don't love that person anymore. And that's why that love needs to be the commitment and based on friendship and more than just those hormones flooding through in the first 6 months to year or whatever. And then, all of us could be getting divorced and remarried every 2 years once you fall out of that limerence stage. That wouldn't be what's best for you,
Another thing I would say is know yourself. We're 4 different personalities up here. And so what is best for me to look for is different from what's best for Susie to look for. Obviously not in terms of character, but if any of you are into the Enneagram, I'm a 6. I love it. So I'm a 6, and what that means for me is I find security in following rules, and I need structure, and I need to-do lists and planning and all of that. And so my strengths and weaknesses play off of my husband, who's a 3-wing too. And I think if I was with a different Enneagram number, our strengths and weaknesses would play different. So the best thing I would say is know yourself, know what your weaknesses are, know what your strengths are, because if you are with a person whose weaknesses are the same as yours, there's a good chance that you can drag each other down into that together. I'm not saying that you can't ever be with someone who you both crave sugar all the time. Like that. I'm not saying necessarily run from that, but be aware of who you are and what you need.
I would add to that somebody who has a servant heart. When you pursue the Lord and you love the Lord, then your goal is to love others and serve others. It's not a self-serving thing. And so when you're in a relationship with somebody else and when you're in a marriage with somebody else, your goal should not be what can this person give to me, but what can I give to this person? And I think that's a very important attitude. So finding that person who loves Jesus but also has that servant heart and wants to serve you in that way and enjoys when you serve them in that way, that it should be kind of a mutual, both of you laying down your own wants and desires for the other person.
And I would say too, the absolute positive guarantee of things you should know is going to be a characteristic of your spouse is that he will disappoint you.
Yeah.
Know that that's going to happen, and then when it happens, you might be a little bit more ready for it than some of us were. But I think that's one of the things that God has designed, partly because through disappointment we have to come together in our pain and share with each other. And also, even more importantly, in those disappointments we have to go to the Lord. And he does not want my marriage to satisfy me 100%. He knows that my husband is not who I was created for. And like Faith said earlier, God is the one that reaches deep in those wells of pain and hard things. And even my deepest joys, there's sometimes when I'm so excited about something, my husband's like, this is great. You know, so the Lord is the one who satisfies you more than the perfect man ever will. And I think I know one perfect man. He's not my husband, but I think I know one. But I bet if I talked to his wife, she would say, no, he really isn't.
We're going to move on to another category, but we might come back to some of those. Thinking through boundaries. Is it sinful to make out before marriage?
I think you have to examine your intentions and why. Any boundary, you have to examine your intentions and why that is the boundary. And so if that's where you decided that your line is it, especially like I said before, if you agreed with other people that this is your line and you cross it, then yeah, there's trust being broken there. But as far as where is the line, that's a hard one. I don't think that I can find chapter and verse to tell you that making out with someone is sinful outside of marriage.
I know people that have put up that boundary for themselves.
Yeah. And I don't think that's an unhealthy boundary to set at all.
Let's leave it.
Right.
Yeah, it is, that's, I
That's
do
the
think
thing.
it is, the thing is that, as, like, especially hormonally, like, that there are certain hormones and different things that happen to your body, the heavier things get, and the heavier things get, the more you want. And so, like, knowing that that's gonna be, like, an actual reality.
And I think also knowing and being able to recognize if something like making out is going to lead to lust for you, because that does change things. The act of making out might not be the sin, but the lust that comes with it might be. And that's a hard one to say because the way one person responds is going to be different from the way another person responds. And that's, I think, in part due to the hormones. I've learned from Faith.
Since you used the word lust,
Mhm.
can we like define what that is so that it's not just hanging out there?
Let's just go for it. Yeah, so there's a question here, which is a great one. It says, what exactly is lust? And what does it mean to be lustful? And maybe we'll kind of stop there and add more to it. Go ahead.
So I want you to go, yeah.
You want me to go? Okay. So another word that I want to throw in here that's not in the question is attraction, because I think it's important for us to distinguish between the two. God created us to be attracted to other humans. And that in and of itself, base level, is not sinful. I was created to have attraction for my husband, and that's okay. What we do with it after that is whether or not it turns into lust. And lust is when we have downgraded that person from image bearer to the object of our pleasure. And then that makes it easier for us to lust after them because we've kind of put off that image bearing part of them. We've no longer we're no longer looking at them as a valued, dignified person, and we're only looking at what can we get out of that relationship. And that shift is the problem. That shift is where it turns into lust.
In James, chapter 1, starting in verse 14. I can't read that part. It says, temptation comes from our own desires. It doesn't say that our own desires are sinful. And it even doesn't say that temptation is sinful, but temptation comes out of your desire. I'm not tempted by stuffed grape leaves. I think they're disgusting. So you could fill the room and I would not take one. Chocolate? I would. So temptation comes from our desires, and then temptation, those desires can give birth to sinful actions. So recognizing that there's the seed of this desire, when we have those temptations, those thoughts, what do we do with them? Do we think about them and feed them and figure out ways to fulfill that desire? Then it's giving birth to sin. But quick prayers, Lord, I'm struggling with these thoughts. Can you replace it? Can you fill my mind with something else? Memorizing scripture is good for that. Playing some music to get your mind off of what you're thinking about is good for that. So it's important to recognize when the seeds of those thoughts are there, because then we need to take them and do something different with them, surrender them to the Lord and replace them with something else. And I will say, this is, I think, related, that for me, I was not much of a reader, but I picked up one of my sisters are really good friends, you guys. Anyway, I picked up somebody that I knew had a novel, and I picked it up, and it described a sex scene very explicitly, and I had never read anything like that before. And it opened these thoughts that I had not had before. And I really struggled for a while with those thoughts, and I had to confess that to the Lord and ask him to replace those thoughts with other things. And knowing that whether it's reading or looking at any type of pornography feeds lust and in a very, very destructive ways. And that's something that the world makes fun of. Pornography is a part of sitcom humor. I've seen it in lots of sitcoms that we all watch. And it is not funny. I've seen marriages fall apart because of pornography. It doesn't end when you're in a marriage. I think people think, oh, I'll stop looking at it when I finally have my sexual partner for life. No, you won't. And so we have to not feed the desires that are there within us with those kinds of images and thoughts. And so that's one of the things that I think, if you've never dabbled in it, flee. Whenever your friends say, look at this, say, nope, this is a boundary, it's dangerous, I'm not doing it. And if it's something you've already struggled with, there is hope and there is help, but fight it like your life depends on it, because it's a dangerous place.
I think it's important to make a plan, whether it's whatever your temptation is, whatever you have identified, this is a problem for me. Make your plan ahead of time before you are in that moment of temptation. What is it that you're going to do? Whether it's you're going to be praying or memorizing scripture or going to a trusted person, whatever it is that's going to occupy your mind instead, make that plan now. Because a lot of us have this tendency that when we're in that moment, we'll go, oh shoot, this is the part where I was supposed to think of something else. And the harder you try to think of something else, the more you're just thinking about that thing. And so if you have already made that plan, then it gives you the out faster, because you've already brought to mind what you're going to do instead.
I think one other thing, since we're talking about that, sometimes if there's something that I'm kind of like caught up in, like I find myself doing the wrong thing over and over again, a sin pattern or whatever, anything at all, sometimes I think, oh my gosh, I need to stop this behavior right now, right? But a lot of times what has been wisdom for me is to say, God, what is this meaning for me, right? Because I know some people there's like a statistic about, by the age of 12, this percentage of the population of people have seen porn, but there are people that stay with it, and a lot of times it has to do with loneliness. It has to do with feeling like we don't measure up, and like no one else would think that we are pretty or sexual or whatever, you know? And so a lot of times that is like okay, how do I find this depth and this level of connection is a literal need for me. And that's part of how God made us, and it's good. It's just that pornography, it's one of those things that, right, it feels like you're filling your stomach, but it's actually still empty, and it's a little bit hungrier, right? And so that sense of like, oh, like, I need to do these things in place, and then sometimes I need to say, like, Jesus, show me why I'm drawn to this, and what is the anti-venom for this? What is it? Is it knowing you more deeply? Is it having more female friends so that I don't feel all alone and disconnected? Is it having guy friends that aren't sexual in any way, but I just know I can be valued in this setting, right? It could be any of those things. And so sometimes I find if something keeps happening and I'm like, wow, I keep doing the same stupid thing, like, that's usually a good time to get off of the like, oh, I'm just gonna stop it, and get on to the like, God, show me why I keep being drawn to this thing.
I wanted to add just one thing to the attraction versus lust. Attraction is okay. Like, God created us as humans to be beautiful. Like, there are beautiful men and beautiful women, and it is okay to look at a man and be like, he is very handsome. Like, that is an okay thing. And I think sometimes, like, we make it feel like you can't appreciate the beauty of another person, and that's just not true. So it's like what Sarah said, like when they become an object that you are using for your own pleasure. I want to kind of continue on the mental temptation thing. So Sarah kind of started to mention some steps that could be taken. Does anyone else have other steps that can be taken when temptation starts to creep up? Or like this question says, the Bible says to flee, but what does that mean to do mentally? How can you get out of your own head? So does anyone else have thoughts on that?
So one of the things I do think is this has to just do with your body, being your body, and that I'm gonna try, even though I'm like totally older than some of your moms, I'm gonna try not to sound too momish right now, but like legit, like your bodies are changing, like they are, and that changes the amount of hormones that are literally going through your brain. And so like any given day can be different than the day before, and some of that is just going to influence your body and how you're thinking. So I've heard really wise counsel in the past about like even things like your brain is going a place you don't want it to go. Sometimes that's like, sometimes that's a spiritual warfare, like not going there, right? And sometimes you need to not be spending 4 hours alone in your room. You need to get out and exercise and relieve some of what is building up in your body. You know, like just those kinds of practical things that are like, okay, so if these hormones are gonna be surging and then I'm gonna be thinking this way because of that, what are some, how do I nip some of that in the bud? Some of it certainly you need to just like fight in the moment. You need to say like, there's like one of my professors said once, like the fatal second look, which is that basically that like David was standing on top of his home and he looked out and he saw a beautiful woman and noticed that she was beautiful. He could have turned and walked away, and again, that would have been a very different story, right? And so that's a sense of like, oh my gosh, you know, like if he had responded like that, though, again, very different. So even knowing and being aware of like, sometimes my body is gonna feel revved up and that's gonna take my brain in place versus my brain taking a body place. And so some for me too, like what Susie had said, I'm imperfect at this, but I try to be pretty intentional about what I let in my brain because I have a very great imagination and I'm a very visual person. So if I see, like there are plenty of things that aren't porn that I can see on TV that I'm like, that was not helpful, you know, and so I try to be really intentional about those kinds of things so that I'm not putting something in my brain that's gonna put me in a worse situation later. that's kind of some of the stuff I do to just be proactive, because I know it's necessary.
Mhm. Look for patterns too, like when do these thoughts creep up? Like Faith had indicated, like is it when at nighttime when you're in bed? Is it after you've watched a certain type of TV show? Is there some type of predictability to it? So then you can take those proactive steps. How far is too far with a guy? The more specific, the better, ladies. Let's go.
So here, I wanna go.
Yes,
Okay?
I know.
So
Go ahead.
here's part of why this matters to me. I work with people all the time. Much more of my population is, non-Christian than is Christian, so can be kind of a moot point for a lot of people. And yet, either way, I see people experiencing consequences to their action that they didn't see coming, because there's no one that says, here's what part of that interaction is. Here is how powerful it is. Here is how vulnerable you just made yourself. And here's how you can't get that back, right? Not in a sense of God in the sky with a lightning bolt consequences, but just this is the way God designed sex to have, to be so intimate and so relational that when it is misused, it can hurt us very deeply. And so one of the things that what I really appreciated, there's this verse in Jeremiah where God is talking to the children of Israel, and he's like, guys, come on, guys, right? And what he says is that my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and hewed out cisterns, which are like wells, for themselves, broken cisterns that can't hold water. And part of what feels, why part of that question really matters to me is, like, from my perspective, the world has this perspective on sexuality, and then God says, like, here's the part we say no about, right? Like, this is the part that's a no. And again, those no's are based on how meaningful he knows sexuality is, and then also his goodness as a father to provide guidelines that are going to protect us in places where we can be protected, right? And so, back in the day on TV, they had these people, and their job was to literally make sure that any risky thing that was done in a show, they were like the moral police. Any risky thing that was done in a show, they had to show a consequence for it, right? So how that would look different today is like on all those Friends episodes that, like, when everyone was having sex all the time, eventually someone would get an STD, and they would show it on TV. At least one of them would have gotten pregnant before they were married, right? That it was like, here's the reality, but Hollywood has stripped that reality away, and so then we can just pretend it's not there, but that doesn't mean it's not there, right? And so what is tricky to me is that basically, like, when it comes to sexuality, the world is saying, like, oh, there's no consequences, just do whatever you want, follow your heart, all that kind of stuff. But, like, the closer you get, or the further you get away from what God's design is for you about that, the further you get from being treated with the dignity that he has given you, and the way he wants you to walk around with your head held high, right? The further you're getting away from the value and a kind of closeness with him, right? And this is in Philippians, it talks about, how we can, essentially the world can be broken, and we can shine like stars in the universe. We can look differently, right? And so essentially I would say, part of that question, not to be a jerk about it, but is a little bit flawed, in the sense of, it's to me, part of what I hear is like, how close can I get to something that's gonna really break me up inside? Guys, don't do it. Don't do that. No. The other part is that there are a lot of different reasons that people are engaging in sexuality, just like I said with pornography. So whether it's like, well, I don't feel comfortable saying my boundaries, or this is the only way I get attention, or like, I didn't think I was pretty, but this person is saying I'm pretty, and so this is how I get to keep them. Or maybe you're just like, well, that person's hot, and I feel like having sex right now. I mean, like, legit, it could just be like hormonal or whatever. But that there is more at stake than just that thing in the moment.
Tell them about that magic
Oh,
hormone
so-
that we're
so
like,
here's
wow,
something-
this is amazing.
So by magic, she means science, for the record. So one of the things I got to learn about, there's a hormone called oxytocin, okay? Oxytocin is a hormone, you may have heard about it, like, so when women deliver babies, right, then afterwards, they have this flow of oxytocin. During orgasm or like heavy cuddling, a lot of times oxytocin is released. And that is a trust hormone, okay? And it's like one of the best ways you can ever feel. And like I said, with childbirth, you know, when they do studies, they say like essentially pushing a baby out of your vagina feels like having 9 bones broken at once. And yet when you see the mom that has that like baby on their chest, they're like smiling, and I have not had this experience. It's hard to imagine. But essentially that's what oxytocin does to you. And they did this study where essentially like, if you guys were in the study, you come in, you have a certain fake amount of money that you're gonna invest. And I'm a fake financial planner. And I am shady, okay? I'm a shady fake financial planner. And you're like, oh my gosh, we're not giving you our money, right? And then the second half of you, they have you snort oxytocin up your nose. And you're like, this seems like a pretty good idea. But here you go. And it's because oxytocin is a hormone that reinforces trust. Whether you should trust the person or not, right? So whether or not this guy is giving you a load of BS about how much you're gonna matter to them afterwards, and how much more, and how this changes everything, and blah, 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 and you have oxytocin flowing through your system, you are unable to say that's not true. You don't have that anymore in your body. And so that's another reason to be like, okay, so I need to be wise about this and be guarded about it. And this is the thing where like, it's not my favorite thing to talk about sex, and when I have a 24-year-old man in my office, I'm like, okay, here's what you need to know. But I go there because I'm like, I just want you to know, like, you're starting to engage in this relationship. This is gonna be a reality. This changes what you're gonna see. But how it changes it is not based on reality anymore. It's based on oxytocin flowing through your system. Yeah. Science.
And that science is, I mean, that science is God's good design, and
Yeah.
that's, you know, it's a good design for marriage to build that trust, but outside of the confines of marriage, it could be very dangerous.
To reinforce that trust and to reinforce, it's also bonding, so it's trust and bonding. To reinforce the bonding of like, yeah, maybe we had this fight over who was gonna make dinner or whatever, but this is a part that reconnects us. This is a part that helps us get through.
Is letting a guy touch certain parts of your body a sin?
I feel like that's a follow-up to question to how far is too far. One of the things I also want to say with that, in it being a flawed question, yes. However, I'm so sympathetic with feeling like, man, if you would just tell me where the line is, like I promise I will not do that. Like that speaks so much to my personality. Like just tell me where the safe zone is and I will stay there. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. And a lot of things in life you'll find are a product of balance, and this is one of those as well. Part of the reason why we are not being specific down to the letter is because the Bible has not been specific down to the letter. What the Bible has said is follow after Jesus. The Bible has been very specific about that. The Bible has been very specific about how we are to treat other people in their image-bearing selves. God has been very specific about trust and how important it is to esteem our brothers and sisters in Christ. He has been very specific about what Faith was talking about earlier, about following after Jesus as the one who can fulfill you, and not expecting another human being to be able to fill that role. And so the reason why we can't be specific down to the letter on these questions is just because the picture is bigger than that, if that makes sense.
If I reword this and say, is a guy touching your body in a sexual way a sin? Because I think there's a difference between touch.
There is, yeah.
Is sexual touch a sin?
Again, like, I think it's something to be wise about, like, with how it leads to the next thing and wanting more. Yeah, that still doesn't answer it.
Is it Son of Solomon that says, "Do not awaken love"?
Yeah,
Mhm.
the words of desire.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's something to keep in mind also. There is an awakening that occurs as you're going through this process that, like, it's one of those, that phrase that we talk about sometimes, I can't unsee that, I can't unhear that. It's a process of awakening that you have to be mindful of.
And it's hard to unawaken with.
Right.
I would push too a little bit with this, just, outside the confines of marriage, if somebody is touching you in a way that is sexual, what is the purpose of that touch? If it is for their consumption or your pleasure only, sex is created to be given to another person in the confines of marriage, to give them pleasure, to serve another person. It's not about letting somebody else consume from you only, or for you to take from them. And outside the confines of marriage, I would be very careful about that, if that makes sense. We're going to get into masturbation from there. Why is masturbation wrong, or is it wrong? Is it a sin? We kind of had two questions there.
So, the word masturbation is not in the Bible anywhere, no matter which translation you have. So we're gonna start there because we want to be careful, right, that we don't set up laws that aren't in the Bible. I think, but it's, again, there's a lot of wisdom to go into that, right? Like, I would say, the same question I would ask about having sex, why are you masturbating? Are you masturbating because you feel alone, because you want sexual pleasure, because that's a release for you, because it's a comfort to you? And then I would say, is there some other, even more legitimate way that God would have to meet that need? Because the scripture doesn't say, like, no, or yes, right? That is something that needs to be part of your conversation with God, especially if you're in a position where that's becoming a pattern for you, like that's a go-to. I would say with that, then asking those kinds of questions, and knowing too that that's another area that some science says, like, masturbation breeds more, the desire for more masturbation, right? And then there's the way that, that's a way where some people would think through, like, okay, is this me meeting my own needs? And then how would this change when I was in marriage? And then is that, is this a way that I am being selfish? Or, so I feel like there's a lot for you to say, like, okay, where am I at with this? God, I need to talk to you openly, whether it's like I'm drawn to this, or, this is a pattern right now, and let me lean into you and hear from you directly about it.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think the other thing that, again, sex is about two people. It was designed for two people to enjoy together and to please one another. And to get yourself in a pattern of self-pleasure could set you up for trouble in marriage when you go to to have a sexual relationship with a spouse, because your body has now been hardwired to respond a certain way. And so you're not learning what sex is like together. Your body has kind of already been trained in a certain way. And so I would caution a little bit with that. And also with masturbation often comes the sin of lust. And so, yes, the Bible doesn't say anything about masturbation, but I would also caution that if that is a struggle for you, and you're noticing that you have lust along with it, then the lust is a sin. And so knowing that is an important thing too. Are you still a virgin if you have masturbated? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I don't even know where you would look that up. It's basically a part like
we
the
think
virgin
yes.
Virgin. Sorry, they're very much more.
Don't get
I want to swing back to this question again, looking at why it's important to wait for marriage. Are we ready for it?
Sure.
Why is it so important to wait for marriage, thinking about sex? Like if you are engaged or in a serious relationship, how does it make it any different?
Before you came in, I asked everyone here if we knew anyone who had been engaged and the engagement was broken off, and every one of us said yes. So even in a serious relationship or an engaged relationship, you still are not in a covenant relationship with that person. And that's when it gets really, really hard, because it feels like, oh, we're almost there. And you are definitely committed to that person, but in God's eyes, you're not in a covenant relationship with them. And so the idea of being intimate with someone because you're engaged to them could still set you up for being sexual in a relationship that isn't your spouse, and the consequences of that. It's one thing to think about.
I would even caution along that line of where it says, or in a serious relationship, because how many people have we known that thought they were in a more serious relationship than the other person thought that they were in? When you have stood together and made that commitment together, there are no longer any questions about who's committed and who's not, and who is serious and who's not. I would just be so fearful of that being not necessarily a reciprocated feeling, especially if we've got that trust hormone that's messing with what we think is real. And I don't think that is an accurate gauge of the commitment level.
I think it's important to define like a covenant relationship. In the Bible, we see God make a covenant relationship with his people a lot. And that covenant relationship is God saying, I'm going to promise this to you. And in the Bible, it's regardless of what you do in return. I am committed to you. You are my people. And we see it a lot over and over again in the Bible. And there's always a sign that God gives to show his covenant relationship with his people. So with Noah and the flood, he makes a covenant relationship with Noah, and he has the sign of a rainbow. With Abraham, it is circumcision. And so there's these signs for a covenant, and there's something special about that points to the nature of that covenant relationship. For Abraham, that circumcision wasn't, it seems weird, but God was promising Abraham an offspring. And where does that offspring come from? Well, it comes from where the circumcision happens. I guess I should say, if we're talking about sex, it comes from the penis. And so it is used, that instrument is used for the offspring, and that is very important, that symbol. Sex for marriage is a covenant relationship because it is two people promising an unending commitment to them, and sex is a symbol of that. And so to take sex outside of the confines of marriage is like using that symbol and kind of saying, I'm going to pretend that this is something it isn't. it is not that relationship, if that makes sense.
And I've heard that you want, and this is again not scriptural, but I think a good principle of, similar to what she's saying, the level of vulnerability to be in line with the level of commitment, right? And so you're essentially giving this level of vulnerability to this level of commitment back here, right? And so we do that with our language and whatever, but we also do that with what we give of our bodies.
Okay, moving into sex. We've been dabbling. We've been dabbling. I've said penis, so I guess we have. So I don't know. Let's look at this. Why is it that if people say that after you do it you can forgive yourself, why would you not just do it?
You could ask that question about every sin or temptation. And going back to something Faith said a long, long time ago, God did not create us to sit back and say, I've got a whole bunch of rules and you better obey them or else. He created us and he has really good things for us. He has good things in store for us. And when we sin against him, there are consequences. It breaks our fellowship with him, but there are also consequences, possibly physical consequences, relationship consequences, and forgiveness. When God graciously offers forgiveness when we confess our sin to him. And there are a lot of examples in the scripture. David's Psalm 51 is the most beautiful confession of sin, but he just lays it out there. And then he talks about being forgiven, and there's another psalm where David expresses again just that definite assurance that he's forgiven. But David had severe consequences for taking somebody else's wife as his own and then committing murder to have her husband killed, so it didn't look like her pregnancy was David's fault before. Anyway, there were consequences, and there are consequences to our sin. The other thing, there are the idea that we can sin and just ask forgiveness and it's okay, to me is a question, do you really understand forgiveness? Do you understand what God's grace is all about? Because his grace cost him everything. And the only reason we can even ask that question is because it doesn't cost us to be forgiven by Christ. He bled, he suffered, he was rejected, he knew shame because of my sin. And to say, well, I'm just going to sin and ask forgiveness throws that in his face every time I do it. And so it's you won't be out of the consequences, and I think it shows just a lack of understanding of what forgiveness really costs.
Nope. What should you be thinking about while having sex?
What to have for breakfast? Are the kids going to come in? Hopefully each other.
Anything? Thinking about the other person, pleasing the other person, I think that's an important thing. Kind of along that theme of serving.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think for me, in our marriage, the sexual relationship has been the spotlight on my selfishness more than almost any other time. And so thinking about how can I be serving the other person is important. And then being able to talk about, things don't always work the way you think they will. And being able to talk to each other about the experiences that you're having is part of we're coming together intimately. So it's not just this physical act that you're both engaging in, but not thinking, I'm mentally thinking about everything at this moment. Then you're not really being intimate. Intimacy is relating to one another and talking through the relationship and just sharing that vulnerable moment together. And But you sometimes do wonder if the kids are coming.
Within the confines of marriage, is the use of contraception okay?
I feel, I mean, I totally listen to the Catholic radio station in the morning because there's no news on it, and so it doesn't stress me out. Like, I can't handle it. And they hit,
I
like,
relate to that so much.
yeah, they really hit the contraception, you know, from their perspective, how, I think maybe it's the church teaching, I haven't read that in scripture. Scripture talks about, you know, like it being an honor, like having a quiver full of children is an honor, and, different things like that. I know a lot of married friends that I have that have had kids those have been prayerful decisions. There have been some times where they have, you know, thought like, I could be done here, and they felt like God was really speaking to them, like, we want you to have more kids or whatever. And so, but then it seems like there are other times where, I don't know, a lady and a man are human beings, and there's only so many children one or two people should have before it's gonna go south. Like, I mean, that, maybe I shouldn't say that, but that seems true, so.
Yeah, I think it's very personal. I did my research on what type of contraception would be best for us, and one of the things I looked into is anything that would not cause abortion, and for us was what we chose. But I don't know, maybe others up here think, yeah, it is wrong, because then are we not trusting God with the results? So it is a tough question, but definitely something you should be talking about and praying about together.
Is it normal to be afraid or scared that you're going to end up doing something you regret? And I just want to keep reading this because I think this is good. It says, I haven't been in any situations where I've had to stand up for myself against someone pushing my boundaries, and I'm afraid something will happen later and I will mess up. How do I live without that fear, knowing that if it might happen, God will always love and forgive me?
I appreciate that this is like a thoughtful person. I do read a couple different things in it, like afraid or scared that I'm gonna do something that I regret. And then also, I have to be in a situation where I might need to stand up for myself against someone trying to push my boundaries, but I'm afraid something will happen later on and I will mess up. So I think it feels to me like there's a couple questions in there, honestly, of like, well, what if I let someone push boundaries that I didn't intend to, kind of, and then also, what if I did more, you know? I feel like you're on the right track if you're asking that question, honestly. Like, you're honoring that you have hormones and that there are people you're gonna find attractive, and that sometimes you might not want to say no, or that you know, like, I don't have very good boundaries, and so, you know, like, I think that's a good question as a starting point for a bunch of other things we've already talked about.
I don't think you need to live in fear, because we've also been promised that when we are in times of temptation, when we turn to the Lord, He will give us a way out. That is a promise that was made to us. Unfortunately, and I'm as guilty as anyone else, I don't always take the out that I'm given. It can be right in front of me, this like 2 open doors, and I will walk through the wrong one. But we do have to acknowledge that there is a way out when you are presented with that temptation.
And I think one thing that comes to mind for me is like that reminder too that, the rules that God has put in place for us as a good father, He's not up there like, they can never do it. I'll never help them either. Good luck with that. Right? It's like He has given us the Holy Spirit. Like, His desire is to help us meet the guidelines that He set up for our own good. Like, He never, it doesn't even make any sense that He would set up all these rules so that we didn't ever need Him because we had it because we were getting the rules perfect. Right? it's like cheating himself out of a relationship. Like, he's like, let me help you, I'd be glad to help you with that, right?
Talking a little bit about modesty. People always say, show off your body and be confident, but then I also have to be modest. How do I dress cute and be confident without crossing the line into immodesty?
I have one solution, the prairie dress that's back. That is so totally modest, and just buy a bunch of them and
Feel
there's
free
your
to do it
answer.
if you want to. I'm calling you out, Susie, I'm calling you out.
Okay.
So are you out on the prairie dress then?
No, they look kind of cute,
Yeah.
so go for it.
I'm wearing one next weekend, Sue. I'm wearing that one next weekend. You can see mine and call me cute. Thank you.
I'm sure I will, I'm sure I will. I think this is one of the challenges, right, because especially, challenges internally and then challenges practically. Like, people have done studies at like the lengths of girls' shorts versus the lengths of boys' shorts. If you go to Target and like literally, like, where would I buy these modest clothes? You know, like, where do they even exist, you know? And so I think sometimes you have to get a little bit creative, whether it's like biker shorts. Like, I've gone to like try and find even biker shorts, and I ended up having to get guy ones, because I said, well, I was like, do you have any that are girls that aren't shorty shorts? And he was like, no, they're all shorty shorts. And I was like, okay, that's what I thought. But like, after I looked all through dicks, I was like, how can this be? But like online, you know, so whether it's like, yeah, I still wear that cute, like, modest-ish mini skirt, but I also have like a pair of shorts on under that. Or, yeah, I do wear those shorts and they have the rips in them, but I also have this, you know? So that can be something, but part of it is the balancing act of like, yeah, I want to value and I want to, I want to present myself in a certain way and I want to look cute, but I would say, like, to me, there are ways you can dress that don't show your dignity as a person. And you should not be the only person responsible for whether your brother sins, right? But I was telling the girls earlier, you should not be the only person. Like, in Jesus says to the guys, he's like, hey, by the way, you know, like, if your eye's causing you to sin, and that was about lust, like, just go ahead and like pluck it out, right? So he wasn't being like, oh, guys get a pass, it's all about how you dress.
Yeah, he didn't say go make that girl get out of church because she, you know, is
Right.
dressing modest. He said poke your own eye out.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. At the same time, I do, like, I respect that guys are visual people because I'm a visual person. And I was telling them earlier, so I am not even attracted to women, and there are some things that girls wear sometimes where I'm like, I can't not look, like, this doesn't even do anything for me, but like, oh my gosh, that's, ooh, you know? So like, you wanna be, like, you want to treat yourself with dignity and also your brothers with dignity too. And then where that balance is, I think, you know, is where the challenge lies, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, knowing your body too, I mean, it's harder for, I mean, just modesty looks different for different people. You know, I struggle sometimes. I'm tall and very thin. My legs are very long, and so shorts are a struggle. And so sometimes you have to be a little bit creative. And I mean, some people who have larger chests, it's a little bit harder at times to be modest because of the way that God has designed their bodies. But we have to realize our bodies are, I mean, like God designed our bodies a certain way. We don't need to be in a sackcloth. Our bodies are beautiful. And we want to dress it, we can dress in a way that shows appreciation for that. It's just, what is our purpose with the way that we're dressing? So, I mean, I think sometimes just recognizing, okay, you know, God made my body this way, this is a good thing, but how do I dress in a way that is not, am I drawing attention to myself in a way that maybe is inappropriate, but also not obsessing over it to the point of feeling like, if you're a beautiful woman, that's an okay thing. You know, God designed us to be beautiful, and we can't control everything. You know, if one of our brothers is looking at us, it's not on us to control all of that. Yeah. Anything else with modesty?
I was just gonna say, like, if you look up here, you can totally tell all of us have breasts. You know, like, and we could have dressed otherwise, but like, it's okay, right?
Sarah's like,
Secrets out, Susan, you're a woman, right? Like, it is what it is. And so now there's a difference between like when you, like if I go to a Renaissance fair and I'm like, is that someone's nipple? Like, oh my God, why is this happening, right? You know, but like in the end, you can tell like
We have a female shape.
we have a female shape, and that is fine. That's how we were designed. It's good and right.
And it's really fun, once you're married, to buy the sexiest dress you would have never bought before, and meet him at the door after work. And dinner will be a little late tonight, so it's kind of fun.
I want to talk about, I'm just picturing you in sexy dress, I'm meeting Dave
Can
at
I
the
tell you,
door.
I did it once and he was an hour late coming home. I was sitting on the steps like this. Dress I went for the door.
Oh. I want to talk a little bit more with boundaries. How we're like moving from something really silly to something very serious, so we shut it off,
We can
guys.
do it, we can do it.
Okay,
What time are you supposed to be done?
8:30.
Okay,
So we're gonna,
all right.
well, 8:45 at the latest, he said. So I want to finish up here. How can you heal from someone doing things without you asking them to, or without asking you first?
Please seek counseling.
Mm-hmm.
It's not okay. It's not okay. It's not your fault. It's not okay for a guy to ever take something that you are not willing to give. And even if you are intimidated or scared or don't know what to say, it's not okay. And so you do need to talk to someone about that. But I think Faith is a great person to talk to. But you talked about just the understanding that we've come to
Yeah,
in
so,
recent years.
a few different things. There are obviously like pretty broad spectrums of unwanted touch. Or even now, there are a lot of things that we say, like that sexual abuse, if there's like a verbal way someone says something that like diminishes you or makes you feel gross or different things like that. So, I feel like one of the things I appreciate in the culture right now and, in my field is how we define, unwanted touch and make some clear distinctions that did not used to be made. Anyway, so one of the things I was talking to them about earlier is that right now statistics are that 1 in 4 women experience some kind of like sexual assault or sexual abuse or whatever by the time they're 18, right? So that's like, there would be 4 people in this room. And that's part of my story, like my personal history, and it's something I've worked through at length. So that is something that is a very real reality. When we talk about it now, anything that happens under the age of 18 with someone over the age of 18, that is not considered consensual, even if you give consent to it, because the law says your brain is not finished, right? You don't know what you are agreeing to. And so I appreciate that current shift because it's really serious. And I know that from my own experience and from experience of working with plenty of people, there is a way that sexual abuse or rape or anything along that continuum, there's a way that it changes your perception of how safe the world is. There's a way it changes your perception and how valuable you are as a person. If there's a way it can change your perception on how much power you have in any given moment, right? There's a way that it steals away dignity that God designed you to have. And then there's a way that the enemy comes in and uses that against you. And so to me, that is something very serious. And there plenty of people that I work with, and my own experiences, there was a lot of years before I said something about it, that the longer you sit in your head with those lies, the harder, like the more that they stand for you, and how powerless you are, and how unsafe the world is, and how, right, those kinds of things. And so, so I would suggest getting support sooner rather than later, and also that your friends are awesome, but current trend is that all the kids that I see that are under age of 18 do therapy with their peers about what we talk about in session. It's not the same as actual therapy. Like, it's good job, guys, way to care about each other, not the same thing, okay? And also, so like talking to your parents, you know, getting set up with a therapist, and then kind of going from there, whatever action you guys decide to take. I know, there's certain laws, so like if one of them came up to me later and said, yeah, that was happening to me and this is the person, then I literally would have to go call someone and be a mandated reporter on your behalf. Because we say, this is a vulnerable population, this crap needs to stop, and we're willing to make some serious laws about it. Now, I would be glad to do that for you. That would also be true in the counseling relationship. They have that same law of like, so that you get to be wise about how much of your story you tell, but that's literally before I say more than hello to a person on a counseling screen on Zoom right now. I'm like, here's what you need to know about mandated reporting. You get to decide what you say about how much you say about your story and where we're gonna take it. So anyway, I think it's really important to know that, even things, part of my story, I remember being like, oh, that's not that big a deal that happened. And I was like, oh, this is such a crazy way to pray, I recommend it. I was like, Lord, if this has mattered in my life, show me. And I had my Bible study girls pray that too. Woo! Like, I think it was like less than 2 days later that I was like literally sobbing my eyes out. I couldn't stop. And I was like, okay, there's an answer for you. Like, this is not okay. This is not what I was designed for, and there's some unlearning that needs to go on here, both in my thinking and even in my physiology of the way that I experience safety or don't experience, or how often I'm triggered in situations, in everyday situations that aren't even sexual.
I want to ask a follow-up, and then we'll take any questions before we're done. If it was forced and the female had any type of pleasure, should she have to deal with that guilt? Okay.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, just like the thing about, we're setting up a fence for you. We're like, here's some guidelines. Sex is on the other side of this fence with marriage. But we're not saying like, and on the other side of the fence, that is gross and nasty. You should like, you know, we're not like, oh, if you kiss the toad, right, you're gonna get warts. Because it's not true, right? And so we don't wanna do that. We wanna say, this is a beautiful thing on the other side. It's imperfect and whatever, but there's a way that God designed our bodies to feel pleasure, and He did it on purpose, right? And so there are certain kinds of sexual acts that are gonna create a certain response in you, and if you have shame about something that you didn't choose for yourself, that is the enemy trying to knock you over and then kick you while you're down by blaming you for getting knocked over, right? So that's the kind of stuff we want to rebuke, but that's the kind of stuff that ends up going so deep that we don't even recognize. Like, it's a very good question, because typically people wouldn't even recognize that they had that kind of shame. It's not as close to the surface. It just changes how we see ourselves. It changes like, well, maybe I should just sleep with every guy because I'm not worth anything anyway, right? We go those places. And so I would say no, like that is something to rebuke, but I would also definitely seek therapy. Yeah.
Any questions that we haven't answered? Okay. I'm just going to close this in prayer then, if that's okay. All right. Father, I just thank you for this time. I thank you for each of these young women. I thank you for their listening ears. I thank you for their questions. And I thank you for just the way that you designed each of them. Lord, I just pray that this time together would be meaningful. I pray that they would think about the things that they have heard and even learned from Pastor Ben during the past couple weeks. We just pray a blessing over them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.